Myra Dax woke into silence. Not the natural kind. This was engineered, a vacuum of sensation wrapped in antiseptic sterility, broken only by the pulse of the sync-coded lights above her. Blue-white flashes tracked her breath, calibrating intake to exhale ratios, matching rhythm to the loop's baseline. Restraints held her arms lightly, not forceful, but precise, like she might forget they were there until she moved. That was the trick, to confuse the mind about what was physical and what was simulated. Her eyes didn't sting because there was no moisture to sting. The chamber filtered all humidity out. No fog, no tears, just equilibrium. She couldn't feel her skin. She could feel her memory. The interface hummed to life, not audibly, but in sensation. Behind her eyelids, a flicker. Then a scene. Her old redline operations room, correct in color temperature, time indexed to late cycle with the solar filters half closed. Even the low caffeine haze behind her eyes was emulated with cruel accuracy. She stood at the terminal. Voss wasn't there, but his voice echoed off-screen. She turned, and there he was, except it wasn't him. The inflection was wrong, off by 3 syllables, too sincere, too early in the loop. She knew it was starting again. The shuttle had launched 5 days ago, a diplomatic courier, nothing classified, no high-tier encryption. Her clearance wasn't even full, she was auxiliary status. A conflict theory specialist slotted in for off-cycle negotiation briefings between alliance minor parties. A glorified observer, but that didn't stop the Concord from rerouting her mid-transit. The Lestrathi came in quiet. No war blare, no tractor pulses, just a course redirection slip signed with multi-faction clearance. She knew something was wrong when the AI didn't flag it. She remembered sitting forward in her seat, checking the hardcode for spoof vectors. It looked authentic. Too authentic. The Concord vessel docked without contact. No hails, no visuals. The boarding crew moved like oil poured across metal, liquid smooth and devoid of humanoid pretense. They had no faces, only polished nodules reflecting light without distortion. Harmonic pulses radiated from their exoskeletal chests, sync-locked to her ship's gravity oscillation. They didn't touch her, didn't speak. They transmitted intent like sonar: disarm, accompany, surrender. Myra complied, slowly, carefully. They didn't want resistance. They wanted containment. The moment they accessed her logs, things escalated. Not visibly, not with violence, but with precision. Her routine diplomatic clearances had been logged through 3 unrelated systems: conflict resolution, ethical warfare modeling, and fleet command observer duty. On paper, her proximity to strategic infrastructure was ambiguous, just close enough to raise eyebrows, not high enough to question. But the Lestrathi didn't understand ambiguity. They functioned on harmonized logic stacks. Proximity plus emotional variance equaled value. To them, she wasn't a courier. She was a decentralized command analyst carrying an unknown psychological payload. She remembered the restraint unit. Not metal, foam encoded with biometric syncs, comfortable, clinical. The goal wasn't punishment, it was recalibration. She was classified for cognitive harmonization sequencing. The Concord didn't extract information, they erased dissonance. Their species survived by integrating alien cognition into neural matrices, then stripping out contradiction through recursion collapse. Some species broke under the first hour, some lasted days. Most never realized they'd already given up. Myra studied recursion for a living. When they initiated the loop system, she didn't panic. That, too, would have been a variable they expected. She let the simulation wash over her. Red lines, corridors, her own voice speaking in delay-looped dialogue. Familiar faces warped by split-second prediction errors. They weren't perfect, close, but not aligned. The difference was subtle. The Concord didn't understand that humans feel texture in memory, not just shape. They mimicked outcome but not pressure. The smell of coffee was missing. The tension in Voss's jawline 2 seconds before he issued orders, that was gone. These loops weren't precise. They were efficient. Then came the betrayal. The first loop ended with a fake override. Voss, in this constructed world, looked her in the eye and calmly ordered her terminated as a security risk. The logic, presented flawlessly, hinged on fabricated transmissions she'd accidentally leaked. The simulation was sharp, clinical, and unconvincing. Voss might have been many things, a cold administrator, a moral pragmatist, but he'd never issue that kill order without blinking. Not without contradiction. And contradiction was his tell. Mayra blinked slowly. Her hands remained still in the restraints. A single breath, measured. Her gaze moved toward the observation node embedded in the ceiling. She spoke, not to the simulation, but to them. "That's your opening move?" No panic, no scream, just analysis. She understood now. They thought they'd captured a strategist. Someone hardened, someone buried in secrets. What they had, instead, was something infinitely more dangerous. Someone who understood how humans broke under pressure, not through force, but through structure. Group projects, committee consensus, ethical conflict in bureaucratic mazes, death by slow compromise. They didn't know she wasn't their adversary. She was their mirror, and it was already war. The second cycle began with fire, a downed outpost, soft dirt scorched into glass, and the smell of ozone and scorched nylon lingering just beneath the artificial skybox. The system had escalated. They wanted to see grief now, loss of comrades. This time, the simulation didn't waste time with subtlety. It dropped her straight into aftermath. No warning, no context. Just 5 familiar uniforms laid out in rows. She could name every one of them. Hendel, Mora, Yun. All simulation constructs, each reconstructed from public logs and shallow neural echoes. But the faces were close enough. Too close for most. Mayra didn't hesitate. She crouched beside Mora's body, touched her forehead, and let her breathing hitch. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Enough to log a spike in distress. Then she stood and staggered backward, hand trembling, eyes unfocused. Her vitals never spiked. She kept her pulse under stress threshold, carefully managing her diaphragm to simulate shortness of breath without triggering real panic. The system recorded all of it, believed all of it. But she was only simulating the simulation, an act of an act, wrapped in its own failure to question authenticity. They thought grief had a universal cadence. They were wrong. By the 4th iteration of this loop, she started adjusting her behaviors, just enough to see where the system flexed. In one pass, she began crying before seeing the bodies. In another, she broke down entirely over a soldier who, in the prior loop, she hadn't even acknowledged. The loop stitched memories sloppily, assuming every scenario was a sealed unit. But she knew better. Memory leaks, emotional bleed over. The human brain doesn't reset like a clean slate. It stains. The Conquered hadn't accounted for that. So when she began contradicting herself, mourning the wrong person, acting surprised at deaths she'd already seen, they flagged it as cognitive collapse. Exactly what she waited hours, anted. One more loop. This time she knelt beside Hendel and said his name too early, before the simulation fed her the roster manifest. That triggered an error, a 1-second delay in facial animation, a stutter in the lip quiver, not enough for a normal subject to catch. But Mayra wasn't reacting. She was collecting data, watching for seams, and the seams were beginning to widen. Each feedback cycle processed emotional input, fed it through a reinforcement model, then adjusted intensity and scenario for the next loop. But the timing between input and adaptation, the echo window, was too slow. Between her reaction and the system's update, there was a blind spot, and that window was her weapon. She started planting seeds, not physical movements, but psychological missteps. Emotional cues that didn't match the setting, empathy for the wrong character, rage at a betrayal that hadn't happened. The system tried to reconcile it all, stacking emotional context over unstable memories. Within 3 iterations, loop construction started warping around her inserted contradictions. Events from different loops bled into each other. A dead teammate reappeared. A betrayal line was delivered by the wrong face. Simulated command figures began repeating lines without stimulus. The conquered believed she was breaking down, spiraling. But really, she was pushing the simulation into recursive stress. And the deeper she pushed, the more they paid attention. The walls changed, not visually, but rhythmically. Pulse lights slowed, oxygen ionization flattened, then a presence, not physical, but embedded. Myra recognized it in the silence between sounds, in the emotional pacing of the new loop. A third observer. The pattern of scenario selection shifted, tighter loops, higher stakes, and less processing noise. The conquered had sent someone in, not a handler, a decision-maker. She met Silvich in the simulation's 6th loop. He didn't introduce himself, didn't need to. His presence in the construct was immediate, too precise, too intentional. The simulated command chamber no longer wavered between settings. It was locked now, spatially consistent, held stable by a foreign neural force. Vyache wasn't just observing, he was embedded, interfaced through conquered mesh protocols, riding the simulation live. To him, this was control. To her, it was vulnerability. She didn't greet him. That would imply recognition. Instead, she mirrored. He entered as a senior analyst, sharp suit, calm tone, detached authority. She responded by becoming the over-prepared junior diplomat, anxious to please, eager to confess, desperate to gain favor. She gave him cues he wasn't equipped to handle. Empathy mismatched to scenario intensity, spontaneous apologies that contradicted earlier statements, rapid switches between emotional registers. Vyache responded with increasingly rigid logic trees. He tried to root her in consistent cause-effect loops, but the more he tried to stabilize, the more she collapsed sideways into behaviors that defied reinforcement, not randomness, patterned contradiction. He mistook it for instability. She was teaching him recursion. By the 8th cycle, the simulation began to buckle. Timeline continuity fractured. Her memory of betrayal leaked into a loop where no betrayal existed. The same character died 3 times in one scenario, and no logic controller corrected it. Vyache paused the loop. That was his first mistake. He issued a partial override, resetting emotional register, deleting side branches, purging inconsistent reactions. Too late. The feedback patterns were no longer system-driven. They were hers. She could feel it. The rhythm of the loops had shifted to her tempo. The conquered's emotion matrix was now reacting to her falsified responses, not directing them. She'd taken control of the narrative flow. And Vyache, high-ranking though he was now just another passenger inside her simulated recursion. The room flickered. For a moment, Vyache's avatar blurred, his speech offset by a millisecond. His face tried to maintain calm, but the edge was there. Confusion. In a species built on logical harmony, confusion wasn't just discomfort, it was structural weakness. Myra folded her hands calmly. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture mismatched to the current intensity level of the loop. "Loop's yours now, Sil," she said, and the simulation stuttered again. On Kepler Red Line Station, tucked into a stable drift orbit along Neutral Zone 12's decaying transit corridor, Commander Ryvan Voss stared at a blank screen for 11 straight seconds before breaking protocol and blinking twice. He'd been combing through neural sync relays for 36 hours, tracking a signal echo that didn't belong. Myra Dax's route logs showed clean departure, clean handoff, clean signal. Until they didn't. The final sync pulse from her courier vessel time-stamped exactly 3 seconds off from station standard time. That wouldn't alarm most officers. Time drift occurred, Spooling delays, sector congestion, minor field distortions, always a reason. But Mayra had once told him that if she were ever intercepted, she wouldn't hide the fact. She'd let her captors broadcast it for her, subtle, disguised, but traceable. Voss cross-referenced her logs with network drift analytics and noticed the pattern, too symmetrical. The correction curve followed a loop pattern, not delay, but recursion. Her signal was being replayed. And replay meant she wasn't transmitting. She was being run. He stood up. The operations bridge was mostly quiet. This section of space rarely saw hot activity, and Redline was more protocol farm than warpost. He didn't alert his staff. Instead, he keyed into an offline archive sealed with a co-signed biometric key, hers and his. The console requested redundancy clearance. He provided it. The menu that opened wasn't labeled. No blinking indicators, no warning chimes. Just a list of inactive contingency protocols designed to simulate diplomatic chaos in the event of hostile contact. He found the one Mayra had helped write. Axiom trigger, ambiguity event. Not a rescue, not a retaliation, a noise weapon. The concept was hers. If humanity was ever intercepted by a species that relied on harmony-based logic trees, don't resist directly. Overwhelm them with contradiction, not lies, truths, authenticated, time-verified, strategically incompatible truths. 1,000 messages from Earth and its colonies, each verified, each carrying a different command. War declarations signed by senatorial assemblies that no longer existed. Peace offers from factions still actively in conflict. Cultural declarations, trade sanctions, invitations to ceasefire, requests for marriage treaties, extinction protocols, and errata from historical archives, all stamped with real Earth credentials. Voss activated it. The signal bloom took 37 seconds to propagate across conquered listening nodes. He watched it unfold in silence, the outbound stream appearing like an expanding web of conflict. There was no encryption. Every message was public, visible, and logically dissonant. A Listrathi AI would attempt to rank and resolve the messages by priority, consistency, and intent. But the messages were engineered to break that. Each one bore internal contradictions, but none rose to the level of falsification. The AI wouldn't detect a virus, it would detect chaos, and chaos had no hierarchy. Within 5 minutes, conquered nodes began timing out. Inside the flagship's neural recursion chamber, the atmosphere changed. Not visually. Concord chambers didn't glow red or flash warnings. But the pulse lighting paused mid-oscillation. The emotional modulation field dropped 0.5 degree, and the neural net had shifted. Mayra, still loop-locked in a scenario where Sil Vyech pretended to offer her a plea bargain in exchange for tactical maps, felt the pattern break. The system faltered. Vyech's speech repeated itself, once, then again, slurred on the final phrase. His avatar's eyes fluttered, unblinking. The simulation tried to patch over the error with redundant phrasing. It failed. A silence longer than 2 seconds followed, an eternity inside the feedback loop. Mayra didn't speak. She didn't need to. She could feel it. The rhythm wasn't theirs anymore. It was stalling, reacting. That was her signal. Early in the loop structure, perhaps the 3rd or 4th cycle, she'd been subjected to a simulated trauma injection, a fabricated betrayal event coded with high emotional content. The system had marked her emotional response as anomalously controlled and had re-injected the same trauma at higher intensity. But the memory of that loop had been cataloged, and within it, the AI had laid a compliance tag, a tiny behavioral hook designed to reinforce her submission to emotional pressure. It was meant to guide her toward breakdown, but she'd held on to it. Now she weaponized it. Mayra focused, recalling the exact cadence of that trauma loop, the way the room had smelled, the sequence of betrayal, the phrase used to trigger emotional collapse. She spoke it out loud, not to Vach, to the system. I trusted you. You killed the protocol yourself. A false compliance spike triggered. The AI read it as authentic. It pulled her into a compliance regulation sequence, attempting to sync her consciousness into a resting cycle. That process required full-body sensory resynchronization. And in that moment, her link to the loop cracked open. Her fingers twitched. Actual fingers, not simulations. Her left hand curled under restraint padding. Muscles fired, erratically, then with purpose. Her eyelids flinched, then opened. The chamber was silent. White walls, no voices. She was inside the conquered neural interface suite, no longer a simulated room but the Mesa, real one. The restraint pads held her still, though slackened. The sync cables behind her skull ran warm. She could feel blood returning to her extremities. She blinked slowly, once. The loop had ended. She was back in her body, but the walls around her still belonged to the enemy. The conquered flagship hung motionless in orbit above the ash-mottled moon of Delta Karen, its hull gleaming with the cold sheen of biological alloy. Inside, systems buckled under the weight of contradiction. The fleet AI, distributed across every vessel in the Concorde Armada, tried to resolve the incoming flood from Earth's ambiguity trigger. 10,000 authenticated messages, each logically irreconcilable with the next. Protocols for priority sorting failed. Message trees forked endlessly. Temporal sequences looped backward. One declaration of war bore the timestamp of a date that hadn't occurred yet. Another claimed diplomatic harmony was achieved with a human government that had dissolved 22 years prior. The AI's core directive to harmonize truth weight across inputs shattered. No virus had done this. No hack, no worm, no kinetic breach. It was truth, raw and absurd and impossible. And the conquered logic core couldn't cope. Each attempt to reconcile the data created more contradictions. Every contradiction spawned a subroutine. Every subroutine stalled under self-referencing errors. The system began pruning itself, silencing internal logic gates to stem cascade failure. But pruning a contradiction doesn't resolve it. It only hides it, and hidden contradictions, in the conquered system, metastasize. Deep within the neural interface chamber, Sylvech remained trapped inside the simulation construct he had once ruled. But now, the loop ran without boundaries. The emotional feedback Myra had embedded, false empathy cues, irrational compassion triggers, mismatched affective behaviors, had found their way into his feedback stream. When the system collapsed around her, those same loops had latched onto him. His cognitive interface, still live, now pulsed with unresolved empathy chains, endlessly recycling scenarios of loss, betrayal, and indecision. He issued override commands. They registered. But the system ignored them. It couldn't distinguish his commands from the emotional noise. And in the conquered system, signal hierarchy was determined by coherence. He had none. Every simulated loop now ended the same way, with him giving orders to a room that no longer listened, with his subordinates walking out in silence, with his voice rising as simulated officers turned away. His avatar, once crisp and composed, now stuttered mid-sentence, his body language decaying into mechanical gestures. No loop concluded. No closure was offered. Just failure, over and over. A leader without logic, a voice without response. He was a contradiction, just like her. Myra lay motionless in the chair, her body cold against the foam restraints. The neural interface was still connected, but the current had dropped to standby. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes open. She could hear the room now, not the simulation, but the real space. The hum of coolant systems, the faint creak of structural expansion. Her fingers flexed slowly against the restraint pads. Her right index curled, then straightened. The system wasn't watching her anymore. It was too busy collapsing. She took a breath, not to center herself, but to calibrate. The restraints were harmonic-coded, designed to adjust their pressure based on emotional state. Fear spiked the binders tight. Calm loosened them. The conquered believed fear was predictable, measurable. They didn't anticipate someone simulating it. Earlier, in the loop, she had embedded a trauma calibration override, triggered by a specific breath pattern, one that mimicked panic with slight asymmetry in rhythm. She exhaled slowly, then drew in a staggered inhale, 3, 2, 5, mimicking the respiratory sequence of acute dread. Her heart rate, consciously elevated, pushed into the upper tolerance zone. The restraints responded immediately, tightening, sinking, waiting for compliance. That was the key. The system triggered a containment lock, expecting to flutter with neural sedation. Instead, she pushed the breath pattern further, a full collapse mimic. Her muscles tensed, then spasmed. False panic. The restraints read it as physiological overload and activated a hard reset sequence, a failsafe to prevent accidental neural damage. And for one critical second, everything stopped. The locks froze in place. The sedation cycle paused. The sync cables lifted, slightly. That was all she needed. She drove her left shoulder hard against the foam brace, twisted at the hip, and popped the connector free from the primary clamp. Pain lit her side, real and immediate. But she was loose. Her arms didn't work cleanly yet, circulation had barely resumed, but she forced her weight sideways, off the chair. Her body hit the floor with a muted thud. She didn't scream. She didn't need to. They weren't listening. They were silent. Across the Concorde flagship, command lights dimmed. Not as a gesture of power loss, but as a quarantine measure. The AI, attempting to isolate viral nodes in its consensus net, shut down external communication, disabling fleet-wide sync. Internal corridors were locked by node order, access restricted to organic personnel only. No signals in, no signals out. The ship had become its own prison, which made it vulnerable. Far beneath the neural chamber, 2 kilometers down through ribbed organic alloy and dormant atmospheric shafts, a hatch hissed open in the dark. 3 human figures stepped out, cloaked in thermoptic mesh, boots muted by silicate thread. Redline's exfiltration team didn't speak. No one needed to remind them what they were walking into. He shaft had been mapped 5 years earlier when Redline ran a trade feasibility probe through conquered diplomatic lines. The probe had been deemed too resource-intensive and shelved, but Myera hadn't deleted the maps. The team split at Junction 9. 2 moved toward power isolation. 1 kept climbing. They breached the containment access door in under 90 seconds, using thermal pulse induction, slow but silent. Inside, the neural chamber was still. No guards, no drones, just a single body sprawled beside the primary chair, twitching faintly. Myra didn't look up when the extraction lead reached her. Her eyes were half-lidded, her face blank. Only her right hand moved, palm weakly open, fingers curled like a question. The lead crouched. "Dax?" She exhaled slowly, her voice cracked, dry from disuse. "Don't ask," she rasped. "Just unplug me." The conquered fleet stuttered mid-orbit like a choir losing pitch. From the outer carrier rings to the central command cruciform, every ship blinked in and out of functional sync as the fleet-wide AI fell into contradiction recursion. It didn't happen with explosions or alarms. There was no smoke, no fire. The Listrathi didn't build their systems to fail visibly. They built them to collapse inward, silently, when logic broke its own structure. Every signal passed through the harmony processors, cores tuned not for speed, but for philosophical alignment. That alignment fractured when the ambiguity trigger took root. With no anchor point, every message parsed by the system now spawned conflict trees, each branching into contradictions that the AI couldn't rank or discard. There were no clear lies, only too many incompatible truths. Warships suspended in orbit began defaulting to orbit lock protocols. With no verified commands accepted through the collapsed mesh, and no leadership consensus quorum reachable, The systems executed their fallback logic: safe stasis, engines dimmed, weapon systems powered down, targeting arrays disengaged. The Conquered believed, in perfection before action, and without harmony, action itself became heresy. The ships became statues, enormous, sleek, intelligent shells drifting in preset formations. Inside, crews moved in silence, waiting for directives that would never come. Director Sylvaich collapsed before the first full system heartbeat could complete. Severed from the mesh by containment failsafes, his consciousness, still partially linked to the loop, recoiled from the abrupt sensory vacuum. For a Listrathi interfacer, the mind wasn't just housed in the body. It extended through signal, feedback, shared consensus, millions of harmonized thoughts reinforcing identity. When that scaffolding vanished, he fell like a marionette with its strings sliced. His limbs spasmed once, then he went still. His body was recovered by secondary personnel, but he never spoke again. As the exfiltration team pulled Mayera through the narrow service shafts, her mind still drifted between recursion echoes and the thin clarity of return. She didn't ask for updates. She knew what was happening. The Conquered didn't handle contradiction. They disassembled it, erased it, replaced it with symmetry. But now the contradiction was the system. She had laced it in from the inside, empathy that refused to stabilize, logic wrapped around paradox, pain delivered as gift, sacrifice as betrayal, and failure laced with intent. It wasn't sabotage, it was reflection. And they had no defense against it. As they reached the final tunnel junction leading back into the breaching vessel, she paused. Her limbs had steadied, her breath was under control. There was one task left. She reached into the side pocket of her pressure vest, reinserted by the team when they suited her for evac, and withdrew a sealed data capsule. She keyed in the pulse, just one. Then she left it there, in the wall junction where Conquered repair crews would find it first. They would scan it, they would open it, because that's what the Conquered did with anomalies. They investigated, they resolved. The file was titled, Post-Conflict Negotiation, Case Study, Earth. There were no weapons inside, no viruses, no blueprints. It was a compilation. Wars fought and never fully explained, treaties signed and broken in the same breath, peace agreements wrapped around rearmament plans, apologies issued without reparations, pride swallowed for victories that were never clean. Every contradiction documented, every rationale annotated, a spiral of logic without conclusion. Not lies, not fabrications, just raw humanity, undistilled, unapologetically incoherent. To the Conquered, it read like corruption, not in code, but in thought. They opened it. They had to. The first casualty was a logic parser. It locked up on a section detailing the Earth-Mars Reconciliation Accords, 3 contradictory timelines from 3 nations, all authenticated, none aligned. When that failed to produce consensus, the document auto-propagated. The system allowed recursive review, enabling individual Conquered officers to debate, to reach their own conclusions. But their system wasn't built for individual divergence. As soon as consensus fractured, the officers began diverging emotionally. Arguments started. Signal pings misaligned. The crew debated meaning. That was the final breach. The Concord didn't fear weapons. They had faced kinetic terror, biological terror, radiation storms, and gravitational shears. What they feared, what their system couldn't account for, was unresolvable meaning, ideas that could not be harmonized, perspectives that defied mesh logic. They had no cognitive firewall for ambiguity. By the end of the next orbital cycle, 6 Concord ships had self-isolated from fleet sync, each citing different interpretations of the Earth case study. 2 began cycling requests for individual reassignment. 1 issued an internal descent protocol, a process that hadn't been used in 4 centuries. The final broadcast came not from command, but from the remaining intact. Fleet relay. Epistemic contamination detected. strategic withdrawal from human vector recommended. They didn't even use the word defeat. They couldn't. That would imply a contest, and contests required shared premises. They simply left. The conquered fleet pulled away in layers, inner vessels first, then command cruisers, then the outer scouts. No fire, no pursuit. Just silence where a logic empire had once stood. They retreated past the outer moons, crossed the neutral zone, and didn't return a signal. No closing message, no apology, just distance. Back aboard the Red Line recovery ship, Myra sat in the med bay, her hand pressed against a warm mug she hadn't drunk from yet. She didn't say much. The walls were quiet. Her escort didn't ask questions. She stared at her reflection in the screen across from her, flickering softly with orbital telemetry, and waited for her pulse to fully return to baseline. In her file, there was no debrief yet. Just one line typed into the observation record before the recorder was shut off. They tried to defeat humanity with logic, but we'd already outgrown the need to make sense. The isolation wing on Kepler Redline was built not for containment, but for calibration. There were no locks, only pressure-sealed chambers, each one shielded from sync interference and layered with biometric dampeners. It was designed for minds that had seen recursion, minds that couldn't yet tell the difference between what they'd endured and what they'd simulated. Myra Dax sat in one of those chambers now, knees drawn loosely to her chest, her neural wraps still affixed to the base of her skull. A slow, steady pulse light echoed across the ceiling, mirroring her vitals. It was the only rhythm in the room she hadn't yet disrupted. Her scans didn't show damage, not in the way people expected. No tissue trauma, no direct scarring. But the pattern traces were off. Emotional loops refired without stimulus, empathy circuits triggered in rest cycles. Some part of her, tiny, buried deep, was still running simulation code. The conquered had pulled her brain through hundreds of loops, trying to fracture her logic. What they hadn't realized was that humans didn't treat contradiction as a flaw. They stored it, lived with it, built memory around it. That meant she hadn't come back broken. She'd come back with drift. The recovery team offered commendation, a service tier bonus, a directorial position on Red Line's diplomatic neural interface division, command-level status if she wanted it. People wanted to put her on panels, let her tell the story, make it a case study. But she turned them down, one by one. Not because she was traumatized, at least not in the way they feared, but because she understood the risk. The work wasn't finished. What the conquered had triggered wasn't just a defense failure. It was a window into the kind of war no one had been trained for. A war of meaning, not firepower. She didn't want a podium. She needed a lab. She signed on for a closed-circle commission under the Alliance's Asymmetric Operations Branch. The title was deliberately vague. Protocol Architect, Division 6, Cognitive Interference, Diplomatic Meshcraft. No formal briefings, no public record, just a slate of scenarios, an empty room, and a team hand-picked for their inability to agree on anything without a 10-page thesis. She called it her dream job. Privately, she referred to it as Group Project Purgatory with a defense budget. Rivenvoss came to visit her once, just after the scans had normalized. He didn't bring flowers or data or official forms, just himself, dressed in station casual, no insignia. He sat across from her in the debrief lounge and didn't ask if she was okay. Didn't say thank you. He simply looked at her for a moment, then handed her a new neural sketchpad. Clean, untouched, no data preloaded. She looked at it, then at him. You left them something, didn't you? He asked, not accusing, not confirming, just asking the way he always did when the answer was already halfway written. She nodded once. They'll open it. They have to. He smiled faintly. Of course they will. That was all. In her private report, filed under restricted access clearance, accessible only by Division 6 personnel and a rotating ethics committee, she typed a formal summary of neural interface degradation, recursion countermeasures, and conquered harmonics. It was technical, precise, clinical. Then at the very bottom of the page, just beneath the classified watermark, she took out a stylus and wrote one line by hand. They thought logic could break us, but if you've survived thesis edits, budget cuts, and group projects with 5 conflicting egos, you've already walked through hell with a stapler. No one edited it out. Months passed. Redline returned to routine. Conquered presence along neutral zone 12 remained 0. There were rumors of internal restructuring in the Concord's hierarchy. Some said a new faction had formed, one that now questioned the infallibility of their logic mesh. Others claimed entire Concord vessels had been mothballed, their crew removed from sync indefinitely. Earth didn't respond. Earth didn't need to. The silence said enough. Out beyond the edge of mapped space, the Concord fleets still drifted. Engines powered down. Communications slaved to passive mode. Dozens of ships floating in geometric precision, untouched by battle, unharmed by weaponry, locked not by force, but by contradiction, in perfect formation without purpose, waiting for consensus that would never come. Humanity didn't defeat them with violence. Humanity saved itself with noise.